Welcome to The Last Generation, the podcast where lived experience meets lasting change. I'm your host, Donna Simmons, author of Ashes to Flame, Transforming Trauma into Purpose, also a survivor, advocate, and truth teller. Today's episode is foundational. It's where we start this journey of unlearning, unveiling, and ultimately healing. This first episode is titled Breaking the Chain, Becoming the Last Generation of Trauma. And that's not just a podcast title. It's a movement, a vow, a vision, a reclamation of power. So let's begin by telling the truth about generational trauma, what it really means, why it runs so deep, and how, yes, even in your lifetime, it can be disrupted. Generational trauma, also known as intergenerational trauma, refers to trauma that isn't just experienced, it's inherited. It's passed down through our DNA like eye color or mannerisms, but it's rooted in pain. It's the emotional legacy of neglect, abuse, addiction, systemic oppression, poverty, war, forced displacement. Traumas that don't end with the person who experienced them. They ripple forward into how we raise our children, how we form relationships, how we view the world and ourselves. Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is a Native American scholar and therapist, and she's credited with conceptualizing historical trauma. She explains that trauma becomes embedded in the family system, and it alters brain chemistry, stress responses, and even gene expression. And here's a really sobering statistic. There's a 2018 study that was published in the Lancet Public Health, and it found that children who experience 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, such as abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction, are 2.4 times more likely to experience depression in adulthood. They're 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. They're 5 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorders, and 10 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence. And guess what? These aren't just individual outcomes. They're patterns that often get repeated without intervention. I've lived this, and maybe you have too. I often say my healing didn't begin with survival. It began with recognition. I was 14 years old in a behavioral health facility, grappling with pain that I didn't yet have language for. I was vulnerable. I was desperate to feel seen. And this was exploited by someone who was supposed to help heal me. A man 15 years older than me that worked at that facility groomed me and ultimately became my legal husband while I was still a child. It's an experience that I carried with silence and shame for far too long. But the truth is, this did not start with me. My mother was a survivor of her own trauma. My grandmother was too. I come from a long line of women that were forced into silence, survival, and sacrifice. But I made a choice, a promise, that I would be the last generation to carry this weight. Now, that choice was not made in a single moment. It was made over years of self-confrontation, self-reflection, community building, and deep soul work. And that is what I want for all of us, a roadmap to choose differently. But making this choice begins with a recognition of the devastation the pain of our ancestors can reverberate through our lives if unhealed. And that brings me to my mother's story, which is shared in more detail in my memoir, Ashes to Flame. In the early 1940s, my mother was born as Mary Elizabeth in Macquarie County, Kentucky. And this is one of the poorest counties in the United States, even present day. She was one of 10 children born to Polly and Elmer. These were my maternal grandparents. and my grandparents lived through the Great Depression in extremely impoverished conditions. They had the scarcity mentality that was so common during that time, and it followed them like a shadow throughout their life. Polly had married Elmer when she was 17, and though she did not speak of details often, when she did, my mom would describe the conditions of her home life growing up as harsh and scarce. My grandparents had a small log home with a dirt floor, an outhouse, and their only clothing was hand-me-downs. The children often only had one outfit to get them through a season or two. This meant Mom made a trip to the nearby creek daily to carry up pails of water they would use for cooking and washing. Mom recalled several times as we would fold laundry together how she would have to wash her flannel shirt and jeans out every evening on the washboard because of all the dust that got stirred up from that dirt floor. She mentioned the menacing ways that other children would make fun of her in the one-room schoolhouse she attended, wrapping up her education in the 8th grade. And this usually came with some expression of appreciation for modern-day washing machines and dryers, as she would hold the freshly laundered fabric to her face and inhale deeply, talking about how good it smelled. This was a stark contrast to the harsh years of her youth when she was, along with her parents and siblings, the definition of tired, dirty, and hungry. Now, Elmer worked in the coal mines the entirety of their marriage, as far as I know. When he passed away behind the steering wheel of his car from a massive heart attack on his way home from work when my mother was 11, it devastated the family. It was 1953, and the youngest of my aunts and uncles was a newborn baby boy and a 1-year-old girl. Mom was devastated, not just at the loss of her father, but also by the impossible weight of responsibility his death placed on her shoulders. My grandmother was also in an impossible position, being an unemployed, uneducated, and unskilled widow with so many children depending on her. I don't know the details of the choices that she made out of survival, but I'm certain they were made from a place of urgency and desperation. It was just a couple of years after this that my mother learned what it meant to become an adult. At just 13 years of age, when she married the man I knew as Dad in 1955. This man was grown enough to already have 2 sons from his first marriage and have already served in the Korean War. My mother became a wife to a soldier and a mother to his 5 and 2-year-old sons when she was just 13 years old. Her education stopped in the 8th grade. Like me growing up, Mom was never treated like a priority. And this internalized lack of self-worth was passed on to me with fury as Mom did not know how to love or nurture in any genuine way. Her only strength in this regard was making things look perfect on the outside to make up for all the dysfunction inside our home. Now, to hear Mom speak of how she felt about Dad when they first married, she thought he hung the moon. She was truly crazy about him and once bragged about how handsome he was in his young years while she was clutching a black and white photo of him in a white t-shirt. His sleeves were rolled up to reveal muscular arms. A pack of Marlboros were tucked in the fold of the sleeve, while he held a glass of scotch to his lips and gazed at the camera with intense eyes. Eyes that held many secrets. Secrets of his experiences in war, his chronic infidelities, his explosive temper, and his own depraved upbringing. I was a teenager before I recognized just how heavy the stone of grief was that my mother carried deep within her chest cavity. I recall one day on the long drive back to London from Elizabethtown, Kentucky, glancing over at her profile as she drove, the shadows from the road dancing across her face, and I saw that her eyes were so worn with exhaustion, and they seemed to be heavily sloped down toward her high cheekbones, while her brow gave the impression of just being permanently furrowed. In all of my memories of my mother, she looked vastly unhappy, filled with nothing more than the embodiment of grief from a life of strife.
Hi, I'm Mariel Hemingway, granddaughter of Ernest Hemingway, actress and lifelong advocate for mental health and healing. Do you ever wonder how someone can rise from unimaginable trauma and turn it into a life of purpose? Do you find yourself searching for stories of resilience, proof that transformation is possible even in the face of overwhelming darkness? Then you need to read Donna Simmons' powerful memoir, Ashes to Flame. This book is not just a story, it's a raw, unfiltered journey through the depths of childhood trauma, emotional and physical abuse, and the systemic failures that perpetuate cycles of harm. Pick up Ashes to Flame today. You will not regret it.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
Now, there's no justification for how my mother treated me growing up. It was horrific. But I can see now through the reflection from my own healing that she had little ability to do anything differently. She was acting out all she had ever known, and unfortunately, I was on the receiving end of her pain manifesting as rage. Now, her rage is what taught me to be resourceful, often hiding under the thick comforter on her bed to soften the blows from the belt she would whip me with, leaving welts and sometimes beads of blood across those swollen lines on my skin. Despite this resourcefulness, I needed my mom. Even at this point on my healing journey, and now in my 40s, I still have moments when I grieve what I had no way of knowing when I was young. As a child, and even as a reflection sometimes now in my middle age, I often wondered what it would have been like to twirl my fingers around her hair or press my cheek against hers, feeling the coolness of her skin against mine. I've imagined what it may have felt like to have her arms wrap around me in a tender expression of love and protection. This scenario has played in my mind time and time again, the vision locked in this fantastical daydream in which she would embrace me lovingly and tell me how glad she was that I was her daughter. I very much longed to look in her eyes as she smiled at me. I so badly wanted to be a source of good and pleasure in her life. But I have learned that my mother's own trauma at the hands of her mother and others made it impossible for her to be consumed with anything beyond the historical occurrences of her own life that dictated her every move, despite whatever the current reality was. My heart breaks knowing how isolating this must have been for her, though I am also very much aware it was a prisoner of her own perpetuation, as she made the choice to remain bound in that cycle. This section of my memoir highlights my mother's early life experiences that shaped her sense of expectation from the world, her delusional sense of normalcy. It was within her own trauma the paving for my early life occurred. Mom did not have the resources or capacity to realize her misery was both an initiation inflicted by her own painful life experiences and her responsibility to name and reframe. Mom had an 8th grade education. Again, she had become a wife at the tender age of 13 to a grown man with 2 sons. These were so much more than challenges. They were downright setbacks. And the intersectionality with so many other barriers to anything other than a life of strife made it damn near impossible to escape. This awareness means we have a responsibility to challenge the systems that perpetuate these issues. And that is one of the things the last generation will accomplish. This topic has especially been heavy on my mind lately because my youngest daughter just graduated high school. She is 17 years old, graduating as valedictorian with a 4.4 GPA, and she already has college credits under her belt because she has been taking courses at a local community college while in high school ever since she started the 9th grade. She's also worked at least 2 jobs at a time since she was 14 years old to be able to start saving money for college. But she hasn't been all seriousness in work. She's also a cheerleader and a tutor, having mentored younger students in need of academic support. And she is beautiful. And oh my goodness, she is fierce and feisty. But she is also tenderhearted, compassionate, and she has a very strong moral compass. Because of all of who she is across the board, she is the ultimate cycle breaker. And she is proof that intentional and mindful parenting with self-reflection and accountability and open communication can establish a firm foundation for children to really thrive. Now, this doesn't mean that they will not encounter problems, of course, but it does mean the ones of their ancestors don't have to be carried by them. Trauma doesn't exist in a vacuum. It intersects with systems, poverty, racism, incarceration, addiction, healthcare inequality. And you can see in my own family history, poverty, disrupted education, lack of knowledge about and even access to both mental and physical health care. All of it is connected and even cyclical. So let's talk numbers, because earlier we mentioned adverse childhood experiences, these events such as childhood sexual abuse, being in a family with a caregiver who misuses substances or alcohol, maybe an incarcerated parent, and so many other adversities. The higher the number of adverse experiences children have, the greater the likelihood of harsh, ongoing life struggles. For example, according to the CDC, adults with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are 7 times more likely to struggle with alcoholism. And Black and Indigenous communities report adverse childhood experiences scores at disproportionately higher rates, in large part due to systemic racism and historical trauma. Over 75% of youth in the juvenile justice system have experienced at least one traumatic event, and nearly 1 in 5 adults with high adverse childhood experience scores develops a chronic illness like diabetes or heart disease. And this isn't because they necessarily made bad choices, but because trauma literally rewires the body. This is not just emotional. It's biological, it's political, it's generational, but most importantly, it's transformable. Now, if you're still listening, this is a good place to acknowledge that you were drawn to this podcast for a reason. Maybe it's because of something that resonates with you from your own family history. Maybe it's something that you know about someone you love. So let's just take a minute to reflect on your own experiences. I want you to think about your family, your parents, their parents. What are the unspoken roles within your family? What topics are never talked about? And are your conversations with your family members filled with genuine connection? Or are things strained and maybe kept at an arm's length or even contentious? Where does the pain live in you? How does it show itself to others? And what if you could name it? What if you didn't have to pass it on? What would it look like if this is the generation, your generation, is where it ends? Okay, so we've talked history, we've talked data. Now let's talk about how we can actually do this work, because trauma recovery is not a Pinterest quote, and it's certainly not a trendy buzzword. It's not always pretty. In fact, it's incredibly messy, but it is possible. I'm going to share with you now 5 key pillars and resources that I have found essential in breaking generational cycles. The first one is naming the wound. Silence is the soil that trauma grows in. When we name what happened, we start to take our power back. And this can be especially difficult because at first, speaking about it means we really have to face it and all the emotions that come with it in waves. But as we allow these emotions to move through us, we lighten in both spirit and our physical bodies. The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is a phenomenal resource to talk about how trauma gets stored in our bodies and exercises that we can do to work to release that. The second pillar is therapeutic support. And I want to be clear here that culturally competent trauma-informed therapy is game-changing. But it's not the only path. So much of what happens within therapeutic settings is just a resource backbone for all the work that you will carry forth in your day-to-day lives. Think about it. You probably only go to therapy once per week, and then you have the other 6 days to really be able to work on yourself. That therapeutic setting should provide you with coping skills and exercises to be able to be more self-reflective. But you ultimately are responsible for integrating that work into your daily practices and truly becoming the embodying of healing. Because healing isn't something that happens to us. Healing is the experience of release that we give ourselves. Now, there are some really dynamic therapeutic supports, such as EMDR, somatic experiencing, internal family systems. These are just a few modalities. Richard Swartz reveals the very impactful methods of leveraging the internal family system for healing from trauma in his book, No Bad Parts. That book has been very integral for my own healing journey, and I invite you to check that out. The third key pillar is reparenting yourself. And this is the process of giving yourself now what you did not receive then. Safety, love, boundaries, affirmations. The internal family system, as I mentioned, is helpful in this as well, creating space for our smaller, younger parts to emerge and be seen and heard by our higher, more developed self. And that can be a powerful form of reparenting. Our fourth pillar is community healing, because healing is not just individual, it's collective. We need spaces where truth is honored and pain is not pathologized. Now, peer-led support groups like Adult Children of Alcoholics, there's Survivors of Incest Anonymous, or even survivor-led healing circles are powerful in forming community and really helping folks to realize they are not alone in their journey. I provide some information on survivor-led healing circles on my website, traumatopurpose.com. And the fifth pillar is finding purpose as a form of medicine, because turning your pain into purpose is not about bypassing the pain. It's about redeeming it. And in my own memoir, Ashes to Flame, I detail this path in depth. Now, future episodes will dive deeper into each of these pillars, so be sure to follow me on social media and subscribe to this podcast so that we can dive deeper into discussion and healing and transforming together. I want to leave you with this. You are not broken. You are breaking free. You are not cursed. You are called to end cycles, to start anew, to create what has never existed in your lineage before. To anyone listening who has survived the unthinkable, who's questioning whether healing is even possible, hear me. You can become the last generation of trauma and the first generation of peace, purpose, and possibility. This podcast is not just a show, it's a space. It's a space for truth, for transformation, and for legacy. Thank you for joining me in this first episode. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and stay tuned because next week we'll be talking about complex post-traumatic stress disorder to explore how trauma rewires our nervous system and how we can rewire it back. Until then, take care of your heart, your body, and your journey. And remember, sometimes your boldest move is being the last. You've been listening to The Last Generation, Transforming Trauma into Purpose. For more resources, visit traumatopurpose.com. If this episode resonated with you, consider leaving a review and joining the community online. Subscribe, and let's transform together.
This podcast is part of the Sound Advice FM network. Sound Advice FM, women's voices amplified.